I'm the Reverend Mary Kate Garden, and I am current chair of the Divinity Associates at the executive at Trinity College. And on behalf of them, behalf of our partners at the Faculty of Divinity and the Reimagining Contemporary Ministries, I'd like to welcome you to this next in a series of events, the Church Outside the Walls. Now, some of you will have been with us from the beginning, and you from last May when we started out with an in-person event with the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, who kicked off our year-long consideration and studying of the church outside the walls, humbler church, humbler church, bigger God. I always reverse that. And we're absolutely delighted that tonight Archbishop Linda Nicholls, Archbishop Anne Germond, and Bishop Victoria Matthews can join us for a consideration of the church outside the walls, past, present, and future. Really, they're offering their perspectives from the as bishops and archbishops in our church. We are so delighted that so many of you have signed up and are interested in this event, and we are looking forward to this. There are people who have signed up from across Canada, and there are students, faculties, clergy, some other bishops, laity, clergy, and just friends of the college who are interested. So before I begin in earnest, just a few housekeeping notes for today's webinar. The event is being recorded. All the participants are muted and chat is disabled. And our event tonight will conclude with a question and answer session. If you have a question for any of the speakers, any of our panelists at the time during the webinar, please enter it in the Q&A box at the bottom, and submitted questions will be passed to our moderator. As we begin, we are, of course, we would like to acknowledge the land on which Trinity College is situated. And we acknowledge that this land and the University of Toronto operate as part of the traditional territories of the Huron-Wendat, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Mississaugas of the Credit, Anishinaabe people, land covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant. We acknowledge the stewardship of this land by First Nations, the continuing presence here of Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and the harm caused by colonialism. We commit ourselves to seeking a new and honorable relationship with the First Nation peoples of this land. Tonight's speakers, as we now know, are accomplished leaders in the Anglican Church of Canada, names that are so familiar to us, and we're incredibly grateful that they have joined us tonight for the discussions and for questions that you will have. In no particular order, I'll begin with Archbishop Linda Nicholls. She, as you well know, has served in many roles, most recently as the primate of the Anglican Church of Canada from 2019 to her retirement just last fall. She was Bishop of the Huron from 2016 to 2019, and a suffragan bishop in the Anglican Diocese of Toronto for 2008 and 2016 after, and she'd been a parish priest for nearly 2 decades after that. She was the first woman to head the Anglican Church of Canada and the second female primate in the Anglican Communion. In my time as an inquirer in the Diocese of Toronto, I know that she spearheaded a program for women who were inquiring to just have a chance to gather, and that was wonderful. Of course, Archbishop Linda has guided the church through the pandemic as a primate. She advanced the work of ongoing work of reconciliation between Indigenous and non-Indigenous Anglicans. She's highlighted anti-racism and is incredibly well known on within the communion on the international stage. Archbishop Linda was educated at Wycliffe College, but she will be receiving an honorary degree this November from Trinity as part of the commemorations for our 70th anniversary of the chapel. Next is Archbishop Anne Germond. She is currently acting primate of Canada, and she has been since 2018 the Metropolitan of the Ecclesiastical Province of Ontario, as well as Bishop of Algoma and Moosonee. She is the first woman to serve as the Bishop of Algoma Diocese and third to hold the position of Archbishop in the Anglican Communion. And the first, you're going to hear a lot of first with our distinguished crowd, but she's the first to hold the role of Metropolitan of Ontario. Archbishop Anne was born in South Africa. She came to Canada. She came first to Ottawa, which is where I am. So we love her for that too. She's a graduate of Thornloe University School of Theology, is just finishing up her term as chancellor. And we at Trinity are proud to have granted her an honorary degree in May of 2024. And last but not least, we have Bishop Victoria Matthews, who's recently celebrated her 30th anniversary of ordination. She was the first female bishop in the Anglican Church of Canada. And whilst she does have an MDiv from Yale, she's a double Trinity alumni, earning a BA and a Master of Theology here. There are many things, like our two other panelists. Bishop Victoria is incredibly accomplished. She served as Bishop of Edmonton for 10 years, and then she was elected as Bishop of Christchurch in the Anglican Church of Aotearoa in New Zealand and Polynesia in 2008. Some of you may well remember there was a critical period when she was serving. There were over 12,000 earthquakes and aftershocks in the cathedral, and the diocese had a tremendous, over 200 buildings badly damaged, including the cathedral, central to the history and, of course, the faith of the Anglicans. Bishop Victoria offered incredible leadership, and through this has come to really value and support mental health initiatives, especially for young people. And she's been active in this at Trinity. She's known for her deep devotional life, and she has made 13, I think that's right, pilgrimage to on the Camino. So and sometimes accompanied by young people. Like our other two panelists, she has nurtured the vocations of young women, and we are absolutely delighted to have all of these leaders with us tonight, and in their official offices, and to really consider what this idea of church outside the walls, what's happening when we listen to what the Holy Spirit is calling us to in the world. So welcome to all three of you. And I will introduce you to Christopher Britton. He is the Trinity College Dean of Divinity and the Margaret E. Fleck Chair of Anglican Studies. Chris has held this position since 2017 and teaches in both divinities and arts and science faculties. And his own research focuses on contemporary Christianity, making him the perfect moderator for this evening. So thank you to all. I'm going to turn off my audio and video and turn you over to Chris. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary Kate and Matthew. Very grateful for all the work you've done to help organize this event, and to Jeffrey Reddy, our director of the Pathways Initiative, for also his involvement. Thank you, everyone who's joined us. I apologize for turning off the chat and that we can't see you, but I think it's pretty clear that 180 some people would trying to do all that would be chaos. So on your behalf, I will host the conversation, and my job is essentially to say as little as possible, so to get out of the way so we can all benefit from listening to our three panelists. But if you do have questions, please do write them into us, and Jeffrey Reddy and I will do our best to sort of distill the main questions that are coming in and offer them to you. So we're going to have a conversation for about an hour with our panelists. We got some questions that will help us focus on the theme, which I'll say a little bit about in a moment. and then we will make time for questions to come up. So we certainly do send in your questions. They'll be filtered through Jeffrey and I, so we can bundle similar questions in and so on. But we will do our best to get as many questions in the time we have. Church Outside the Walls is a series developed by Divinity Associates Executive, focusing on looking at both the contemporary state of the contemporary church and its calling in our time, particularly to serve the world and all of God's creation, to engage with the communities outside of us, and to understand ourselves as, of course, the church has its buildings and its location and its traditions, but of course, all of that exists for the purpose of serving God and neighbor, and as we continually learn to appreciate more and more deeply all of God's creation. And so this is the third in a series on that theme, and we hope you will find this a helpful conversation for thinking about what that means for the church and as it confronts the challenges in our time. I'm deeply honored to be among these three distinguished leaders of the church. And to help us get started, I'm going to invite them to offer a little bit of context about themselves, something that's really influenced them as a church leader. And so I'd invite them to either reflect on a certain person who's influenced their decision to consider leadership in the church. So let's help sort of embark them on this journey, or somewhat more in their current roles or their recent ministry, someone who has represented for them the kind of leader that they think is needed today. So on either of those questions, and simply because it's in a certain corner of my Zoom room, I would invite Archbishop Linda, if you might begin, please.
Thank you very much, Chris. I'm going to answer both of those questions, partly because I wanted to especially answer the first one, to say that the person who probably most influenced my decision when I was early on discerning a call to ministry was on this call right now, was Victoria. Victoria was the curate in the neighboring parish to my home parish, where I had come back to after being overseas for 5 years. And she was the first woman I saw in leadership in ministry, and opened up the possibility of that for me. So I wanted to, I always remember that, Victoria. You were at St. Andrews and I was at St. Timothy's. Today, the person that I would reflect upon is a companion and a colleague in the companion diocese to the Diocese of Huron, Archbishop Mercedes Besoto. Mercedes is the only woman primate, alongside Anne, at this time in the Anglican Communion. She's the companion diocesan bishop of Brazil, and she's the diocesan bishop of Amazonia. And why I name her is she's young, she's passionate about God's creation. She is serving sacrificially in a diocese that most people would think is impossible, incredibly large, with very few stipendiary clergy, having to travel in dangerous places in order to conduct her ministry, and yet also being a voice on the international stage in the Anglican Communion and worldwide. And she does it with grace and joy, and she reaches out beyond the walls all the time. So she's somebody I look to. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Linda. Archbishop Germond, do you want to follow up on that?
Thank you. Well, good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be part of this panel conversation, and just to have the opportunity to offer some reflections on leadership in the church. I'm going to speak a little bit about my context of growing up in South Africa, which at the time that I became more involved in leadership in the church, when I was about 18 years old. It was a time when there were very few women in leadership positions, And certainly in South Africa at that time, in the late 1970s, 1980s, the ordination of women was not a thing. In fact, one of my close friends in the youth group said that, you know, the best thing for a woman would be to support their husband in ministry. And so when I think about the people who encouraged me to take on more leadership roles in the church, they were people who were deeply committed Christians and who were unafraid of speaking about their faith. And there were a number of them. At that time, I can't name one person. There were teachers in high school. There were curates at the parish I attended. But the one thing for sure was that they modeled a way of being in Christ that was that bore the fruits of the Spirit. There was great humility. There was kindness. There was an openness to inviting somebody like me who was just a high school student to sit on the council of the church. And so that was the first position I accepted, was to become a member of parish council at 18. And just to watch the leadership circle embracing somebody who really didn't know what was going on was for me a sign of a leader, and somebody that I still would consider that today, somebody who invites new faces, new voices to participate in those kinds of gatherings.
Thank you, Archbishop Anne. Bishop Matthews.
Thank you. I'm going to do a very quick reference right back to when I was not even in high school, when there was a priest of the Diocese of Toronto called Canon Bagley. He was the chaplain at Bishop Strawn's school, and he was the first person I ever heard speak of the possibility of the ordination of women to holy orders. He also, when I was in grade 7, introduced us to biblical criticism. He was a man ahead of his time. One line of his, I remember, he said, "They haven't figured out yet that pregnancy only takes 9 months. Once they've got that worked out, you might as well all become priests." So it was quite wonderful. And now I'm going to jump right ahead to very recent times and say someone who I found inspirational in the last few weeks has been the Bishop of Washington, D.C., Bishop Marianne Budde. And although when she spoke that powerful sermon on unity before the President of the United States, she was very much within the walls. But we have to remember that the walls in Scripture are often for protection. And so she spoke in the sanctuary of that National Cathedral and called out the President of the United States, as I'm sure almost everybody listening is aware. So I want to salute her and thank her for reminding us that sometimes you really have to step out and say what people need to hear.
Thank you, Bishop Victoria. I'm going to forego any follow-up questions for that. I mean, first, it's just, I think, helpful for us to think about that. But those of you who are wanting to hear more about the Bishop of Washington, just know we've already received 2 questions on that topic. So we will save that for now. So let's turn for the moment, just sort of talking about where we are, where our guests, our panelists think we are today in terms of thinking about the theme. And so I wonder if you would, bishops and archbishops would think about the challenges, or maybe perhaps a challenge, it might be helpful, that you think that has presented itself to the church that leads it to undertake new conversations or considers new ways of being. And this time, perhaps, might we, I ask Archbishop Anne to begin.
For sure, thank you. Well, I think the time in recent years that many of us had our entire lives disrupted in a huge and enormous way was 5 years ago in March when COVID hit. And we were literally forced out of our church buildings, out of our common worship, out of every kind of gathering. And immediately, within a few days, such was the desire for people to gather that they found new ways of communicating, of meeting through Zoom, in for online forums, finding ways to connect with one another as a community of faith, and also finding ways to reach out to the community who were at home, isolated and lonely. And I actually think that COVID and the experience of being isolated and separated from one another has taught us about new ways of gathering as church. But I wanted also to speak about another disruption that that happened in one of our communities, where a church building, for many reasons, could no longer sustain the congregation that it held. And through a lot of intentional conversation, came to the conclusion that that parish needed to exit their building and join with another congregation in the city and become a new creation, a new parish, and left that building. There was sorrow. There were people who were greatly hurt by the fact that their ministry was no longer sustainable. There was anger and a lot of concern that people would just walk away from the church. Some probably did. But what happened was that in that upheaval and in that time of great unknowing, we discovered that there was on the property of the church a Métis burial site. And so we reached out to the Métis Nation of Ontario to have conversation with them, to say, we've got this old church building and we want to honor those who are buried on this land. And would you be interested in having the building? That was nearly 8 years ago. And in November this year, I went to the opening of the Métis Heritage Center here in Sault Ste. Marie. The whole building has been transformed into this beautiful site where the Métis are lots of artifacts, Métis artifacts. And the logo on the outside of the building, they actually chose to have the building of St. John's there. And it really did feel in that moment like a phoenix rising out of the ashes. So that disruption, the unknowing that led to courageous conversations has led to this something new on our journey to reconciliation and a deeper understanding of the Métis people of Ontario. So that's one of the disruptions I wanted to speak about. I'm sure that Linda and Victoria have got others.
Indeed, no doubt. And I think we will probably return to some of those themes that you touched on, Archbishop, but let's carry on for the moment. Bishop Victoria.
Thank you. On September 4th, 2010, I finished giving my charge at the opening service of the Synod of the Diocese of Christchurch in New Zealand, and went home to get ready for the opening of Synod, the business session, the next morning. But at 4:35 that morning, which is before we began Synod, there was a 7.1 earthquake. And 20 of the buildings, church buildings of the diocese were very, very badly damaged, and almost all were affected. Sometime later in 2011, in February, there was yet another, and many, many more buildings were taken down. So what I want to say is you can't get much more disruption than one day you have a building with everything in it, and the next day you don't. Now, the only good news is when one of those earthquakes, yet another one, happened on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas, I realized it was unsafe for those who even had buildings to worship inside. So someone fed me the wonderful reminder of where sheep may safely graze. And I said, we're going to have to move outside. Now, you do have to remember, in New Zealand, Christmas is in the summer, so it's not quite what you're imagining, perhaps. But that opened, well, not doors, because they didn't have doors, but that opened an invitation to the community to come and see what the church did without having to enter a building. And it was quite extraordinary. I ended up in Littleton in a very large field where they actually managed to get an extension cord so we had some sound, and all sorts of people came and worshiped because somehow the threat of being religious had dropped. So as time went on, of course, we rebuilt some of the buildings, some were left. It's all a very complicated story, but it does tell us that when there is a major disruption, there is more opportunity than we can easily imagine, and that we really need to look for that possibility in the disruption.
Thank you very much. So more on walls, both as opportunities to be hospitable in new ways, but also walls as barriers, or at least causing division that when they come down lead to new discoveries. So thank you. We'll return to those perhaps physical walls soon, but first, Archbishop Linda.
Well, I'm going to suggest something that is not about physical walls. It is the fact that for, I would say, the entirety of my ministry, there have been conversations about the challenges around human sexuality. And much of my ministry as a bishop and in the national office was around trying to help the church think about that. That challenge that came to us through social change, through historical changes, lots of changes happening around us, forced the church to begin to have conversations it did not want to have, and very, very painful conversations. But it has forced us to learn how to talk to one another in the midst of disagreement, how to listen to the voices around us, both from science and faith and community and social norms and differences, It has forced us to talk across cultural differences, both within Canada and across the Anglican Communion. And having watched these conversations over 3, 4 decades, I would say we have slowly and gradually learned how to have better conversations on difficult topics. We've learned ways to listen, ways to discern together. I've been to many general synods, and some of them have been very difficult, and some of them have found ways to be able to have those discussions. That conversation is not over. There's lots of disagreement that still exists. But I do think that the church has been able to face up to it. And I do believe that the Holy Spirit is speaking through that work, even though it may take us decades more to come to any single or unified position. In the meantime, we can be at table together and have those conversations. So I just wanted to raise that one up as one that's certainly been at the forefront throughout the entirety of my ministry, both within Canada and internationally.
Okay, thank you all. So some events in the life of the church that have informed it, hopefully equipped it to better engage with what's outside the wall, the physical walls of the church, and to engage with it. Before we leave behind the references to the buildings in at least two of our answers, is there anything? We live in a time, of course, when church buildings are very much part of the conversation, both their value or their presence in many communities, both as parts of key parts of the neighborhood or way they house important services and communities, but also as sometimes burdens, right? As limitations or confinements, or sometimes simply financial burdens, and the mourning and frustration goes around that. Is there anything else you would like to add, just about thoughts about that, the challenge actually of the physical walls or the buildings that are a big part of our tradition, and a wonderful resource, but also sometimes a real challenge and burden?
Maybe I could
sure,
jump in,
please.
and
Sure.
just a couple of things come to mind. One is accompanying a parish where the building was attacked by an arsonist, and waking up on 6 a.m. on a Monday morning to hearing the CBC telling me about a church that was burning in Whitby. And I thought, oh, my first thought was, I hope it's not one of ours, and it was. But again, a disruption that opened up an incredible response from the community around, incredible pain, incredible struggle, but also a chance to rethink and think afresh about what the building is for. The other time that I recall is a week before my installation as the Bishop of Huron. The cathedral in London was being renovated, or not renovated, it was being repaired, and the roof trusses had rotted with water infiltration. And a week before my installation, the workers who were working on it downed tools and said it's not safe, the whole building is shifting. And if you know that cathedral, it is huge. So for it to be shifting was extremely dangerous, and the city shut it down, which meant that my installation took place in a United Church, a very Methodist looking United Church. And I remember thinking, this is so strange. The liturgist of the day was having a canary trying to figure out how to make an Anglican liturgy work in a Methodist style church. But I felt it was a sign of the future, that here was a sibling church sharing its space with us. And we were rejoicing in a moment of celebration in a style that was different, but we could share it. And I think that sharing of building space that's going on more and more and more with Lutherans and Anglicans, with Methodists and Anglicans, with even Roman Catholics and Anglicans, I think, Anne, you have a story about that, is pointing us to the fact that the buildings are just the container that holds the ecclesia, the people, the church. and we're finding ourselves able to do things differently around those buildings.
Thank you. I've got a couple of stories about that kind of an event when Bishop Tom Corsten was consecrated as the Bishop of Moosonee back in 2009. The cathedral in Timmins was too small to hold the number of people from all around James Bay, from Watershed Deanery, the bishops and other friends who would be traveling up to Timmins for the consecration. And so the consecration was actually held in the Catholic Cathedral in Timmins. And after the consecration, we processed down the road. And this is where the beautiful witness of the church was and remains. We processed down the main road so that the new Bishop of Moosonee could be seated in his own cathedral. And so there was that beautiful friendship with the generosity of the Bishop of Timmins saying, for sure, come and use our space. And I'm always struck now as the Metropolitan when I preside at consecrations and we gather in procession outside of the church walls and then process into a cathedral, because often there are people standing on the sidewalk wondering to themselves, what is all this about? Who are these people? What are they doing? And to go back to Bishop Buddy, that sermon of hers and her prophetic words of challenge, spoken so lovingly, have opened up the possibility that some people are curious about what happens in church. And I wonder, just as after other disruptive events, the 9/11, so many people started going back to church. I wonder how many people, because of that sermon, have darkened the doors of the church, who haven't done it before, because they're curious about how the church has changed over the years. My other story about the walls is that we have north of Sault Ste. Marie a community where the highway between Sault Ste. Marie and Wawa White River is so often shut down in the winter because of storms that for a number of months people are unable to receive communion. And I have a friendship with the Catholic bishop of this area, and there is a special canon or rule in the Catholic Church that allows for non-Catholics to receive communion if there is no physical, if there's no way that they can receive it in any other way. And so our Anglican community were able to receive communion in a Catholic church with the blessing and permission of the bishop. So beyond the walls, things are happening.
Wonderful. Thank you. Bishop Victoria, were you wanting to add or
I'll just mention the transitional or cardboard cathedral that we built in Christchurch after the earthquakes. It was at a time when you really couldn't get into many of the buildings because it was just too unsafe. One of the Methodist churches, the insurance company said, you've got to go in and get the organ out. And they went in, there was an aftershock, and 2 people died. So we chose to be very, very careful. One thing that we could do is create a structure that was very light and very simple. So the transitional cathedral, called the Cardboard Cathedral, is actually an A-frame seated on containers that seats about 500 people. And again, because it was different, and because the actual ceiling or roof, I should say, allowed the light to come in and the light of the church service at night to go out, it became a place of pilgrimage almost. Travel books said, if you do anything this year, you've got to go see the transitional cathedral. So again, the gospel was preached because of a disruption and an innovation that cost a fraction of what building a usual cathedral would be.
Well, thank you. Thank you for those reflections on actual physical walls and how they can be new opportunities and resources in ways. Our conversation has touched on relationship with the church with Indigenous peoples, and all three of you have had significant roles in working with Indigenous communities and Indigenous Christians and Indigenous neighbors. So I wonder if we might turn to that next and just share something about your perspective on either the successes or the ongoing challenges or the future of the churches in relation to the truth and reconciliation processes or a relationship with Indigenous communities here in Canada. Bishop Victoria, might you begin on this topic?
I'd be delighted. I'm going to tell a very simple story, which happened in the Diocese of Moosonee when I was helping out there just until very recently. And the congregation when I arrived at St. Matthew's Cathedral was really quite small and having a very difficult time. But they did have a very small outreach. And when you do outreach in Timmins, Ontario, you are often reaching out to the Indigenous population. We changed that outreach a bit. We invited them into the hall and we began a series of meals. And we didn't even say grace at the beginning of the meal because we didn't want to be seen as pushing it. We would gather to pray ourselves. We would be always open to praying with people who came, but we weren't pushing any agenda. That was absolutely transformative. And probably the biggest change came when out of the blue, one of the other outreach programs, Feeding People, closed down. And we, in 2 hours' notice, found out that there was be no meal that night and managed to put on a meal. It was pretty basic, peanut butter and jam sandwiches, but it was what we had. And we found the relationship was quite extraordinary. Again, doors opened, windows opened. We rejoiced in their friendship and they appreciated our friendship. By the time that I left, almost 2 years later, more and more were coming into the church, but not because we were pushing that, but because a relationship had formed. So I, in a very relaxed way, I see that as building reconciliation because it quickly moved from not being us and them, but simply us as we enjoyed breaking bread together.
Bishop Linda?
Yes, I'd say my experience with our Indigenous communities has been mostly in the last less than 10 years, particularly when I came to the Diocese of Huron, in which there are 7 Indigenous communities in which there are Anglican parishes. And then as primate traveling across Canada and meeting Indigenous people and working with ACIP, the Anglican Council of Indigenous Peoples. I'd say my experience has been primarily one of getting my foot out of my mouth over and over and over and over again. And the need for non-Indigenous people to stop talking and listen. Just spend time listening and listening and listening. You know, there's so much wrapped up in our truth and reconciliation needs, particularly around colonialism, racism, systemic issues in our church and in our society. What I am constantly profoundly moved by is the tremendous respect there is for the church amongst Anglican Indigenous peoples. There's a deep respect for the church and for the role, the respect given to me as primate, even as I was always often chastised for not doing something or doing it wrong or not having finished something, but it was always with a respect for the position I held within the church. I've also been incredibly humbled by the need to listen to how God has been present in Indigenous communities long before missionaries and the gospel came. So how has God's presence and the recognition of Christ in the communities, how is that able to be expressed in ways that are culturally appropriate, that are that speak to their history and concerns? And what can I come alongside and learn from stopping long enough to listen? Has been certainly the piece for me that's been so critical. Watching Sacred Circle, being invited to Sacred Circle, having to listen to the stories of pain and struggle. But more recently, seeing a whole generation of somewhat younger leaders, not a lot of them in the church, I'd have to say. Most of these are in society and alongside the church. But seeing them come with passion and articulate ways of wanting to both reinvigorate their own communities, people, and cultures, in recognition that we will be walking alongside and together going forward. And I have great hope for that leadership that I see in the arts, in music, in literature, in theater, in the media. And I see a few of them in the church as well. And I look forward to seeing what they will do and what they will teach us.
Thank you.
I'm deeply humbled when I sit with Indigenous peoples and just feel I have so much to learn from their lived experience and through their deep, deep spirituality and what they have to bring to our church. So much of the connection that I have with Indigenous people is in homes, in home communities, and often involves food, hospitality, welcome, stories, and it's often around times of tragedy in a community when there's been a death, or a celebration. And one of the things that I appreciate so much about the Indigenous communities that I've visited is how the whole community comes to grieve together. So that notion that when one part of the body is grieving, the whole body grieves with it. And when one celebrates, we all celebrate together. And so to participate in a confirmation celebration on the east coast of James Bay, where the hall was just filled with hundreds and hundreds of people coming to celebrate this confirmation service. And the same at a time of death, when the whole community gathers around a family. And I think of some of our practices now, how death is viewed by by many people now, where there's no memorial or funeral or celebration of life or acknowledgement. Indigenous people come together to cry for days on end, and it's that honoring of a life well lived. But Chris, I think we've still got a long road to hoe. You know, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, as was true in South Africa, it unearthed terrible tragedies and terrible hurts. And I think it was Archbishop Fred, another one of my great heroes in leadership, who said, we can never say sorry, we can never apologize often enough for what has happened. And so I just, you know, to sit in a sacred circle with Indigenous peoples and hear their stories brings me to my knees, to that place of confession. And you know, we need our church buildings for that reason. We need to get down on our knees, both to praise God and to confess. And so I struggle still, because I think we've got a long way to go still.
Thank you all. Yes, agreed. I mean, I heard themes of humility, of listening, of the process being far from complete, and the healing far from over, and of course the new relationship, more healed, more restored, more redeemed relationship yet to be lived into. But thank you for all of that. We've been thinking about some of the challenges, some of the things that have shaped the church's response of thinking about beyond the walls. I wonder if we begin to look to the future at this point, and begin to imagine or comment on where you think we are in terms of discerning where the Holy Spirit is leading Christians and the church in the next 10 to 20 years. What will the reaching beyond the physical or the traditional walls of the church mean, or where are we being called in new ways or in deeper ways than from where we are today? Archbishop Linda, might you begin on that?
Yeah. One of the things that's been central to my ministry has always been ecumenical engagement. It started long before I went into the ministry, and you know, I was a cradle Anglican, am a cradle Anglican, but I also was a musician for a Presbyterian church, and I lived in India in an ecumenical gathering of people teaching at an international Christian high school. And over the years in my ministry, I've been involved with ecumenical dialogue, certainly with Roman Catholics very extensively, but also in the Full Communion Partnership with the Lutheran Church and now the Moravian Church. And it seems to me that the Holy Spirit is leading us to a recognition of John 17, you know, that we may be one, that we may be one. We don't have to be uniform. We don't have to worship the same. We don't have to have the same polity, but we need to recognize in each other the presence of God in Jesus Christ. And we need to know that in the differences between us, we can learn from those differences. And certainly in my engagement with the Anglican Roman Catholic dialogue over some 30 years, coming alongside to look deeply at the other and find in that new questions that arise for me in my own community, and ways in which I need to rethink things, ways in which I need to embrace the other. I loved Margaret O'Gara was one of my professors at U of T, and she just had a wonderful way of talking about the gifts that come from ecumenical dialogue, the gifts we give one another. And I do think that the Holy Spirit is calling us to not throw rocks at each other, although we might want to ask some critical questions at times of each other. We have to also be prepared to receive those questions. So I do think that the Holy Spirit is leading us As I said, my installation in Huron was in a United Church, and I really enjoyed the time that we had the Churches Beyond Borders, which is the Evangelical Lutheran Church in Canada, Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the Episcopal Church, and the Anglican Church of Canada. And the 4 leaders and staff would meet together and recognize that together we could do so much more, and we could learn from each other in ways that we hadn't anticipated. So I often look to that ecumenical experience as being one of the ways that we're being led. I also think we're being led into a far deeper humility. I've long looked at Anglicanism in Canada, particularly in central Canada, where I think we've had if I can call it, an inflated view of our own importance. I can remember as a young cleric, somebody commenting that Louis Garnsworthy could pick up the phone and phone the premier and get on the line right away. Well, that's long gone. I don't think Doug Ford takes calls from clergy in the same way. And that's a good thing. I think we need to recognize that we are not in power. Our decline in numbers, our decline in influence is causing us to take a deeper look with greater humility. But at the same time, I think the kind of sermon that Marion Buddy gave is the call to us to be prophetic within our communities for the common good. And it's calling us outside of our churches. It's calling us to ask, how do we be a witness in daily life, not just on Sunday mornings, but in daily life for the good of the whole community, to what God is calling us to do and be, and what God longs for the whole community to be. So those are just a couple of starting places for me.
Thank you. Much to chew on there. Archbishop Anne.
So I'll jump in. I think that the ecumenical piece is huge for the future. And the other piece I think God is calling us to is our partnerships. And by partnerships, I mean global partnerships and national partnerships, interdiocesan partnerships, provincial partnerships, congregational partnerships. One of the not surprises as the acting primate of Canada is to meet so many incredibly gifted, committed people across the church who have extraordinary gifts, which they truly give so freely and so generously, sitting on many committees and doing important work for our church. One specific thing that I wanted to talk about, because we opened up by speaking about leadership and the influences on our own leadership. Just last week, Andrea Mann, who serves as the director for global relations in the Anglican Church of Canada, traveled to Lesotho in South Africa. And there she met with 4 of what are known as the Africa 6. So there are 6 women bishops in Africa. And Andrea, with her vast knowledge and her expertise in global relations, spent some time in Lesotho empowering the leadership of those women to then empower other women in their communities. And I think that's Andrea went as someone who has knowledge, who has expertise, but went very much to, from what she described, it was very much a give and take, learning as much as and receiving back as much as she was offering. And I think those are the kinds of relationships and partnerships we need to be looking at in the church, especially as so many immigrants, students are coming to our shores and renewing our churches. with their presence and the gifts that they're bringing. So how do we form more meaningful and more partnerships?
Church outside the walls of our denomination, the church outside the walls of our fragile egos, the church beyond the borders of our nation, our country. Bishop Victoria.
Thank you. Really almost picking up from the very end of Archbishop Anne's comments. We live in Canada, has a large number of people coming in, and I think we've forgotten that there's a curiosity about the church. I can't count the number of times I've been minding my own business, but wearing a collar somewhere, and people have come up and asked questions. It's also happened after church when there's been, say, a baptism, whatever. People are hungry, but they don't quite know how to ask the questions or where to go to ask the questions. So I think one of the things the Holy Spirit is calling us to is to really have an Acts 2 where people are able to hear in their own language. And certainly this Diocese of Toronto has done a marvelous job of many languages for the liturgy, but to actually get out beyond the walls and be seen as being open and have people question us. And one place that is able to happen without us pushing any agenda is work with refugees. Because they're coming into a new country and they have more questions than we could ever imagine. And to simply show hospitality, picking up from Archbishop Linda, humility, absolutely, but a ministry of presence where the Holy Spirit is able to dwell with those who gather, whatever the setting is.
Thank you. That point as well. To our those in attendance, we're coming close to the time we'll begin to pick up some of your questions. But as for another future-looking question, I wonder if you, each of you, would offer a thought about some advice, whether that's to divinity students or to newly ordained clergy or to lay leaders early in their ministry, about how to understand or to engage with our changing church context, or what it means to live as a church outside the walls. So any advice you might have for younger church leaders in this time, and how to engage with in this way, the ways we've been discussing with our world. Archbishop Anne, if you might begin.
Well, the first thing I would say is don't be afraid, because we've all been in that place of wondering, what the heck am I doing here? Is this for me? Can I continue? There's so much that is unknown. I think it was Susan Beaumont who wrote that book, How to Lead Where You Don't Know Where You're Going, and spoke about liminal time. And I wonder if every time is liminal time. And but I want to encourage those folk who are registered in courses, who are discerning a call to ministry, to not to give up too soon, because there are lots of people who would say, well, there are no full-time ministries, or the church is dwindling at such a fast rate, you won't have a position in 10, 15, 20 years time. But my word of encouragement would be to say that this is God's church, and that the church has gone through challenging times, through times of disruption over and over again, and there will be more. But to trust that if the Holy Spirit is tapping you on the shoulder, to offer yourself for ministry, to keep doing the work, to keep being faithful, to keep a life of prayer, to meet regularly with others, to just to be steadfast, I would say, to not to give up too soon, to keep moving forward.
Lord.
Or we didn't hear you, Chris.
Oh, I'm sorry, Bishop Victoria, pardon me.
Oh, pardon me. Thank you. Uh, as much as I agree, and I do totally with Archbishop Anne saying we've all been afraid and so on, which is true. I think I've spent more time fearfully in the church than I could count. But at the same time, I would say push yourself out of your comfort zone. Back a few years when we had more money, there was the possibility of a few students every summer going and spending 3 months in a third world country, usually in ministry. And I think that was great. We don't probably have those funds at the moment, but we have this thing called the Council of the North. These are mostly northern dioceses, sparsely populated and really seriously under serviced in terms of ministry and clergy and so on. See if your college would let you go and spend a term there. It could be the summer, it could be another time. Go and immerse yourself in a different culture, because that's going to be the way of the future. I have learned so much from going into other cultures. They have given me so much more than I could ever give them. And I thank every one of them, whether it was Haiti when I was a student, or New Zealand, or the various places I've traveled with the Anglican Communion. They've always fed me so very richly. So don't, there used to be a joke about there are people in the Diocese of Toronto who think that you can't go any further north than Shepherd Avenue. Well, I heard the other day it was now St. Clair Avenue, so things are getting worse. But go where you can't imagine yourself being, and learn from those people, and give your heart to them, and God will bless you in that relationship and that unraveling of hospitality. So.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would just want to reiterate what both Anne and Victoria have said. Certainly, I think number one is, before all else, you are a child of God, and you must nurture your own relationship with God, and do that diligently, and do it with, again, I'll say humility and self-examination, because ministry will challenge every part of you. It will dig deep into your soul. And you need to have the resources and the practice in your daily devotional life of relationship with God that will ground and secure you. You need to nurture the friendships and family around you, people who loved you long before you answered this call. Nurture those relationships. They will be critical. And nurture connection with the world outside the church. Have a hobby that keeps you connected with people who couldn't care less what happens on a Sunday morning, who don't have a clue what a narthex is, and do not care whether you adequately served as a subdeacon. You want people who think differently than you, atheists, agnostics, and people of other faiths. Allow them to challenge your assumptions about God, about life, about relationships. And I would double down on what Victoria said about go somewhere else, live outside of your own culture, because it's only when you're removed from it, you begin to realize all the assumptions that you live by, that you have never examined. My time living in India was so formative for making me look at my privilege, my understanding of myself. So whether it's Council of the North or go and volunteer somewhere for a month or 2 months or 3 months, many churches in the Anglican Communion would be delighted to have a volunteer come and work with them. And lastly, just love the church. Love the church when it's at its most awful and painful, and at its most glorious, because you're going to have to serve it for your life, and you need to be able to love it, even when it. And lastly, have a cat.
Even if you're a dog
It teaches
person?
you, it teaches you both humility and sacrifice, because cats just have staff. They don't care who you are.
Okay, lots of wisdom in those answers. And I mean, there's we've heard a lot about the benefits of living outside the country or having an international experience, but just one other nuance. I teach as a first-year undergraduate class in the arts program here, and on day one, an international student in his first year from the Middle East, he came up to me and he says, "Have you ever lived in another country or immigrated somewhere?" And when I was able to say yes, I think that started to build a bond that wouldn't otherwise be there. Not because I lived in the Middle East, I've been there, but I haven't lived there. But I think he thought I had some idea of what he's going through, and that was useful. And so also just to help build bridges and have an understanding of what people who are going through migrations are experiencing and facing challenges can be really useful. Thank you. These are our set questions we've gone through. I did sort of combine two just to allow some time to try to make sure we get to some of your questions. We're going to do our best to honor some of the things you've asked. A few of you have asked about Bishop Buddy, Bishop of Washington, and her address at the National Prayer Service on the day after the inauguration in the United States. So we have a sense of what our panelists think about that or would appreciate about that sermon. So I guess my rendering, if those of you who sent questions in will permit, is rather than comment on what you think about her sermon, as leaders who yourselves have had to face and navigate challenging situations, including criticism of decisions or not responding in ways that others wanted you to or expected you to. I wonder what advice you might have for people facing challenging situations and wanting to speak the gospel, the truth, to perhaps challenge momentum that they see as problematic. And if any advice you have to such people, or if it's more helpful for you just to think about how to understand the kind of negative reaction of the kind we've seen in some circles against an address like Bishop Buddy offered. So either advice or just how to help understand what that kind of reaction. I'll let anyone begin. So please, anyone who feels moved to take up that question.
Maybe I can start by just saying, I think whenever you are contemplating that kind of prophetic word, it needs to be really grounded in lots of prayer and careful thoughtfulness about, why you're doing it. We can get caught up in our own egos and our own power. So are we doing it for the right reasons? And then there will be times where you feel you must speak strongly. And there will be opposition, guaranteed. And at that point, all you can do is recognize your own vulnerability before God, because God alone is your judge at that moment. And you cannot control how other people will respond to what you say. You can only trust that you've done your best to be honest and faithful to what God has called you to do and to be and to say. And then I think one of the things that impressed me most about Bishop Buddy was not just what she said, but afterwards when she was challenged And she said, I am ready and willing to sit down with anyone who would like to have a conversation with me. She was not defensive. Somebody, challenged her, oh, do you need a security detail or whatever now? And she said, no, the people who need security are the vulnerable. She stayed with exactly what she knew she'd been called to say. She didn't defend herself in that, and she offered to remain open to the conversation. And that's the kind of Christ-like vulnerability that we're called to as leaders. But it's very costly, and you have to know that before you go in it.
I also wanted to add to that. It wasn't just what Bishop Buddy said, it was the way in which she spoke. There was not an angry self-righteousness about her sermon, particularly at the end when she was addressing the president directly. There was a love. There was a concern. She was speaking truth to power, but the way she spoke was measured. You could see that she had spent a lot of time prayerfully considering those words. And so I think it's not just what we say, but it's how we say it that matters as well.
I would absolutely agree with both Archbishop Linda, Archbishop Anne. The only thing I'd add, and this is going in a different direction, but I just totally agree with what's been said, is wherever you live, wherever God calls you to ministry, develop relationships that are beyond the church. Because the day will come, may not be an earthquake, and it may not be what's going on in the United States, but something will happen. And at that point, you need a relationship with your member of parliament, with the local mayor. You don't have to be buddy-buddy, but you sure need to have those relationships. And that, of course, includes all the ecumenical and interfaith relationships. And so I always think when you first go to a place, you spend a lot of time going, introducing yourself, just beginning to lay down the groundwork. I remember going in Timmins to the food bank in South Porcupine, and they were just unbelievably overwhelmed that I would come to see them. And I thought, that's sad. Where else would I go? And then, of course, from there developed an excellent relationship, and we did certain things together and so on. But that mutual hospitality, that reaching out in relationship, that's a pretty important foundation. And of course, it's all undergrounded by prayer.
We've got the theme of prayer and support and discernment going on. There's a few questions here about navigating, really difficult times as a leader. Yeah, so we're touching on it now, but I just wonder if I'd invite the questions just in case there's some follow-up. We've got so the questions come in sort of two ways. One is sort of more general about the current moment. And a rector serving in the United States doesn't. It sounds like that's not their native country, so living in a different place and going through really troubling times and having moments when I just want to run home for comfort, right? How to keep going or what sustains, right? And I'll add I'll bundle another question with that. There's a few questions related to the fact that you are indeed women in leadership roles and that there continue to be resistance in some circles to women's leadership in institutions, in the church, and sexism. And so perhaps in that very particular way, how does one, when one feels like running home for comfort, find ways to keep going? So in either of those contexts, just the resilience and the capacity to keep on going despite this difficulty. Might you comment further on that?
I'll jump in briefly for this. Going back to the whole life of prayer and devotion, we need to be honest in our relationship with God. If the day comes, and it probably will, that you want to shake your fist and yell at God, our God is big enough for that. But we can't be pious bunnies in our prayer and then go out and hate the church, because that is completely at odds with itself. So we need to be deeply honest with God and then beg God, who is always more willing to give than we are to ask, to sustain us with the strength we need for those very, very difficult times. I remember saying once, I was back in New Zealand briefly, and I said to someone who was having a really difficult time, and I said rather lightly, I said, is it, have you got to the point where you're looking at the want ads in the newspaper? And he said, well, that was months ago. So it's more common than we think. It's a matter of actually realizing this is so much bigger than what we have to offer. So God had best be with us every step of the way.
Speak about the place of peer support, of spiritual friendships, of trusted companions on the road who will pray with you. So often after I've made a difficult decision, there are people I'll turn to, and the most wonderful thing is for somebody to say, let's pray together right now, because prayer leads us more deeply into our life with God. For me, silence and stillness and contemplation and walking and just stepping back from it all for a bit. I think that with the growing angst and anxiety, the answer isn't always to scroll down Facebook more. For me, it's to step back from it more, to find the still center, where I know God is, and but just having a circle of friends and spiritual companions is huge.
Yes, I would agree with both Victoria and Anne. And I want to say something that may be misunderstood, so I just need to be a little careful here, that I am always needing to remember that I am a child of God. I was a child of God, baptized as an infant, and my journey with God is not dependent on the role that I've been called to in the church at this time. So to not over-identify with one's current role, because it can be easy to just get so immersed in it that you forget that before and after it, as I'm discovering, you are a person and you're a beloved child of God. And that beloved child of God needs to be nurtured and cared for, physically, mentally, spiritually. One of the things that I discovered about halfway through my ministry was that I had to return to something that nurtured my soul that had nothing to do with the church. And for me, that's music. And so ever since then, I've been part of a community choir that sings music that I know will challenge me. I'm in a choir now that's working on both the Doorderflay and the Foray Requiems, and it's just wonderful to go to choir practice and just be able to be in the back row of the second sopranos, and I'm not in charge of anything, but I can create something beautiful. So it's having a hobby that will that will allow you to be creative, that will allow you to continue that relationship with God that's not dependent on you being a priest or a bishop or a warden or an altar guild president. It has everything to do with you just being loved for who you are and having friends who knew you before you were any of those things and who will hold you accountable to yourself. I've had some very, very good companions on my journey, including a friend who has always been there to hold me accountable to me, not to my role, just. And those are really important to nurture. Just to comment a bit on the woman question. It's a little harder to tell these days whether people are opposed to you as a woman, or they're opposed because they don't like your leadership style, or they're opposed because you just made a decision they don't like. I've given up trying to sort that out because I can't separate myself, my personality, my leadership style, the way I am, from who I am as a person and as a woman in the world. And so for me, that's a non-starter to even try to worry about that any longer. Sometimes I've had to take a step back and realize that opposition has come from a place that was just about gender, or at least that was influenced by gender. But I can't change that for that person other than to be honest about a conversation and try to sort out the relationship. But I do occasionally run against it in international circles. Not much, but occasionally.
Thank you all for being willing to share something on that, or rather challenging question or issue. And I hope that your answers have helped people from all kinds of different locations, including those who are facing walls presented to them because of ethnicity or sexual orientation, or others that you heard something in that. But I think there's some questions that lead us build on this, but in a more positive direction. So I invite us to turn to that. One question from Lisa is curious to hear who your favorite female character in the Bible or the early church is. So let's turn to that. If you were to choose one, you may well have a list. So, but for our purposes, if you would choose one woman in the Bible or in the early church that you find inspiring or helpful, or just comes to mind in face of this question. Well, might we, Bishop Victoria?
It's a great question, and if I had more time to think about it, I might go elsewhere. But I'm going to say the Abbess Hilda, who presided over the Synod of Whitby, which, whether they made the right decision or not is another question, but between the Roman Church and the Celtic Church. But she was the abbess of a coeducational monastery. She was a visionary. I have, from a young age, because I heard her story early on, continued to think this was a woman of vision and determination. And she spoke truth to power as well.
One of the women in the scriptures who's inspired me is Elizabeth, John the Baptist's mother, the woman who waited, who was faithful, and then who supported Mary, right? Just the friendship of women. And I often just think of Elizabeth's ability to live as the Luke describes her as living blamelessly and putting up with so much what must have been great shame in the community at that time, and yet who just lifted her head high.
Well, at risk of being very prosaic, I'd have to say it's Mary. And mostly because I had the opportunity to do the spiritual exercises of Ignatius in the late 90s. And as part of those exercises, there is a practice of praying with Mary, which as a Wycliffe grad was kind of a new thought. Like,
Mhm.
oh, not sure about this. But it turned out to be a very, very rich part of my spiritual exercises and continues to be, and not certainly Mary as a young woman, but especially Mary at the end of Jesus' life. And the maturity and the grief and the wisdom that Mary would have acquired at that point, and to be able to pray with her in that has been very powerful for me.
Just to our audience, we've got about 10, 15 minutes left. So this isn't the last question like on Ezra Klein, and I'm not going to ask for 3 books. But we have been asked, what are you reading right now? And so if there's something that you're reading or have read recently that you'd be glad to share with us, what might that be?
I'm reading a book by Eugene Peterson called Practice Resurrection. And it's on Paul's letter to the Ephesians. And it's just such a book that is filled with hope and yeah, how to live as a people of the resurrection in these times.
Well, I'd have to say, as a newly retired person, most of my reading has been fiction. However, I was recently given a book that I really quite enjoyed. It's edited by Don Davis and Matthew Flotting. It's a spiritual formation and theological education. It's entitled Experience. And I think Don's introduction on the spiritual formation for ministry is really very perceptive of what's needed at the present time. And I'm enjoying reading some of the short articles from the variety of authors in that.
I've also been reading quite a lot of fiction, but I did read recently, I was looking for the title, the story of a competition, if you will, of who could sail around the world solo fastest, and the stress and strain on each of them, given their very, very different personalities. 2 of them go crazy and commit suicide, partly because of dishonesty in it, and they just can't face coming back. Really, only one of them, they're all men, actually did it. So he was the winner. But the challenge of being only with yourself, facing your worst fears and your greatest hopes, was a good read.
Wonderful. Thank you. So women from the early church or the Bible who have nurtured or inspired you to some reading that nourishes you. Can I ask, as Susan Spicer asked us to ask, what gives you hope these days?
I certainly have struggled a little bit with that in light of everything that's happening politically. I just, it is hard, especially for baby boomers, to comprehend the changes in our world, because we grew up, or at least I grew up with there was such a sense of optimism and, you know, life is just going to get better kind of thing. And all of a sudden we're facing things that seem to be a repeat of history. And so finding hope is challenging. One of the things I've discovered is the very first place for me is creation, is being able to simply go for a walk every day and look for a sign of the grace of God in the beauty of whatever is happening that day, whether it's a snowstorm, whether it's the sparkling snow, whether it's the wind, whatever it is. It's looking for that reminder that creation is able to heal itself. I mean, if we all disappeared, the world would heal itself. The other place I look for hope is in the small actions of very faithful people. As primate, one of the greatest joys was traveling across Canada and in the smallest of towns and communities, coming across people who were faithfully living the gospel, reaching out to their neighbors, loving their neighbor as themselves, with very few resources. From a tiny little church in a glass-fronted stall in a little strip mall in Athabasca, to the Indigenous community in Rigolet, reaching out and helping support a shelter for women escaping domestic violence in a very small community. But the faithfulness of people and their joy in community just gives me hope that despite what's happening on the big world stage and in the great political upheavals that we're seeing, watching the people of Gaza go back and say, we're going to build again. We're going to build again. Those are the things that, for me, alongside of good music, give me hope.
I would just echo a lot of what Archbishop Linda said. But seeing the people of Gaza, thousands and thousands and thousands of them, that's home for them. And when I see that, watch the television and the news, I say, where are they living tonight? What are they having for dinner tonight? Where are they sleeping? And yet just seeing their resilience and their desire to go back to the land that they love, that is home for them, it's a huge sign of hope and possibility. But also are those, as Linda described, the faithful men and women gathering in scripture circles to do gospel-based discipleship. On Sunday, I was at a Lutheran Anglican gathering, and there was a sewing presented, which will go to a girls' school in Africa. And the woman in charge of the sewing said, it's not just Lutherans and Anglicans who are coming together to sew. It's the United Church. We're all together in this. And I thought, that is the future of the church. No barriers, no walls, meeting in in a basement of a church. And yet, such a desire to serve, to love, to care, to reach out, all signs of hope. And I have to say, seeing the emergence of little ones in church again, little people wanting to carry the cross down the aisle or, be acolytes, very hopeful.
I would certainly agree with what both archbishops have said. So tempting to say something different, but in total agreement with what they've said, is I actually find hope when both what Archbishop Linda said, I look upon the wonder of creation, whether it's the ocean or the wind or the trees, that gives me hope. But the other thing is when I sit in silence and I become aware at a deeper level that God is with me. And however shocking the headlines are, God has not left us alone. And that gives me enormous hope and deep, deep thanksgiving.
Thank you. Just absorbing some of that. I do think we've got to turn to our final question. So with your permission, I'm going to sort of bundle three questions that I think are related. So so after speaking out of your own place of going for support and strength and to be renewed, some questions about speaking to our troubled times now. So some sort of three versions of the question. You can answer, any one of those or of some combination. Well, first, Archbishop Linda mentioned that, probably can't imagine that a bishop just picks up the phone and gets the premier on the phone. But let's imagine that one of our politicians, one of our political leaders calls you up, right? And says, look, all right, these are difficult times. I'm wrestling with things. Give me some advice. What would you say to a political leader who opened the door? Right? Or what would you say would be the good news that people in North America really need to hear right now? What might that be? How would you share or present God's grace or describe that to someone right now? Or for those feeling deeply alienated or anxious right now, what might you say? Any one of those or combinations, I invite you to leave our audience with. I know, no, leave the hard question for the end. It should have been, what are you reading right now? But I don't listen to enough Ezra Klein, so apologies to our panelists.
I'm going to speak about a time when a politician did call me. In the small community where I live, there was a homicide of a woman by her male partner, and the community reeled. It was shocking because this is a small town where these kinds of things don't happen. They don't happen to us. They happen somewhere else. But the truth is that these shocking events are happening more and more, domestic violence, abuse. And the MPP called and said, we want to do something, but we need spiritual leadership. And will you come and stand with us? And will you offer prayer? And will you speak a word of good news and hope to this community that are really struggling? And will you come and do it knowing that the perpetrator's family and the perpetrator in this instance had died, that his family is going to be there as well? And so it may not be an easy gathering. Will you come? And I think that's where the ministry of the church is so powerful in difficult times, because it is a ministry of prayer. It is a ministry of presence. It is a ministry of going to difficult places. And sometimes when there are not the right words, it is sometimes just being there, just actually standing there in that difficult place. And I did go, and we did have a vigil, and I offered words, and community leaders offered words, and it was a real moment of the community coming together in a hard time. And since then, in our diocese, there have been 2 more of those kinds of really horrendous acts of violence. And on both occasions, the church has opened its doors and said, we're going to have a vigil. and the clergy or the lay members of the congregation have phoned and said, we don't even know what to do or say, but we just want to be there. And I speak of that powerful ministry of presence that comes from a place of our own prayerfulness, of our own ability to speak a word of good news into dark times, and to say, without saying very much, you can be the light of Christ in this moment, and you will radiate that light. And so I think, Chris, just being brave enough to go and to stand there and to offer words of hope.
Thank you. I appreciate
It's
that.
not easy, though.
Indeed. No.
Archbishop Anne's story has taken me back to after the earthquakes in New Zealand. And after the first one where no one died, we put a sign outside the churches that were still standing and various other places, just simply open to talk and pray. And we had some response. Then we realized that probably what we really needed was to say, there's tea and coffee and the soup's been made. And more people came to share the stories of what they had lost. They may have lost their house or maybe just no electricity. Then the killer earthquake, as I called it, happened in 2011 in February 22nd, and 185 people died. And I was drawn into really serious leadership of the city during that time, to the point where you're asked to go on TV to speak to people about what they have experienced. And I knew there was nothing in my preparation that gave me either the right or the resources to do that. But you go in humility and honesty, and you go to share the suffering that we were all sharing. Then there came the time where there was the burial of the remains that could not be identified, and also a service for those who we knew had died, but we could find no remains of those bodies. And then I'm going back a bit, one other time, being asked to go into the center of the city with families who had lost a loved one because they wanted to see where their father, their husband, their child had died. Now, nothing that I have ever learned in a classroom or in community could prepare me for that. But I was human and broken, and I knew God's love. I didn't speak about God particularly, but I went and I stood in silence with those families. I did say prayers with the remains or the empty boxes, and I knew that by keeping alongside them, that God would be able to work something that I could never put into words.
I think to take a slightly different tack on the questions, in the midst of what we're experiencing now, and so much of the last few years has been things that have happened where nobody can predict what the next 6 months would bring or the next year would bring. And it can be hard to not want to give answers, that we're supposed to be the people that have it all worked out, and we're supposed to have the answers. We don't have the answers. But what we do have is a perspective on the world as God's world and history as God's, and a long perspective that says that God's will be done. It may not be within our lifetime in the ways that we would want, but to hold up a hope for the longer arc of history of God's relationship with God's people that is faithful, always present, never failing, and always available to draw on for strength, especially when we cannot see tomorrow or the next day or the next day. So I think being able to help see that longer arc, I would agree absolutely of being present. I think here in the city I live in London, when the attack on the Muslim mosque in Quebec happened, it was one of the Anglican clergy in the city that within 12 hours had organized the mayor, the chief of police, myself, the rabbi, the Roman Catholic bishop, to all gather on the steps of the mosque to say, this is not who we are as a community, and to speak to the Muslim community and offer them our support and prayer. So that kind of presence that can articulate that, the kind of presence that Mary and Buddy had in the cathedral in Washington, and the fact that we'll be called on for resilience in the face of the unknown for some time to come. And that's, and we do it together. We do it in community. I think one of the things that I've seen so much of is this driving people apart and individualizing everything. It's all about me, or it's all about, mine, when the gospel is all about us and we being the whole community, those who are vulnerable, those who are strong, those who are weak, and we're together in this. And the way we will get through it is together. And that's why the gatherings, like Victoria's talked about, being with people in those moments of crisis, gathering for the vigils to be able to say to people, God is here in our midst, and we can cry together even when we cannot see the end. So those are some of the ways I think that I would want to, and just being present. I'm still amazed when people say to me, thank you so much for the way you led us through COVID. Well, I thought, well, I was in my living room. I wasn't leading much of anything. But there was something about being online and being able to be online with people, that just being present with a Bible study for an hour. So that being together, however small, was profound. Yeah.
And people don't forget. I served as the chaplain for the local police station, for the local police service for a number of years, 10 years, and formed these wonderful friendships with some of the police officers and their families. Well, I have left that city 8 years ago. I was in Ottawa on New Year's Day in a cab on my way to have dinner with a friend, and the phone rang, and it was the police service saying, we've got a situation in the hospital. Can you come? And I said, I'm 6 hours away. They said, well, we didn't know who else to phone. We had your number. And I said, I'll get a priest there right away. So I think those relationships that are formed in those ordinary times, difficult times, people remember and call you.
Thank you all, Archbishop Linda, Bishop Victoria, Archbishop. And it's not for me to do the final thank yous or the closing remarks, but I can't resist saying this. In a very recent sermon, Rowan Williams said this about the church. The church is not the place that lifts humans to heaven. Instead, the church is a place where humans let themselves be lifted. And I think that vision captures some of the conversation this evening about the church. And I hope everyone who's been in attendance and listening has found themselves in some way lifted by the gift of this conversation. And on that, I will turn us back over to our Divinity Associate Executive, principally Matthew Keysweater. Matthew.
Thank you, Dean Britton. And humility was a theme of the conversation these last 2 hours. And so I will start on a note of humility and confession that what does it say about me that as we are exploring going beyond our walls, the coffee mug I picked was a whole bunch of buildings. What does it say that I am wired naturally to go towards that. So I appreciate being taken out of my comfort zone and many of our comfort zones. We've heard so much wisdom from Archbishop Anne and Archbishop Linda and Bishop Victoria in speaking about curiosity. Curiosity that is raised and piqued when we are in public, when we are, say, in procession outside, when we are worshiping outside. We heard about mentors and companions along the way. People who were ahead of their time, people with prophetic witness, people embodying the gifts of the Spirit, all of those people giving birth to new things and orienting us towards the new things that God is doing. We heard about disruption, the reality of surprise and loss and challenge, the reality of grief and anger, but also the reality of opportunities more than we could ever imagine in those moments of disruption. And we heard so much about relationships across boundaries, relationships into surrounding communities, and relationships across cultures. All of that, I believe, turning us towards to the presence of God who is with us and for us within, but also certainly beyond the walls of our buildings. So thank you, Archbishop Anne, Archbishop Linda, and Bishop Victoria for your wisdom and presence and honest sharings this evening. And thank you on behalf of the Trinity Divinity Associates Executive and the Faculty of Divinity and Office of Development and Alumni Affairs at Trinity College. Thank you to all who participated and had ears wide open. And we were just so touched by the robust response of our event this evening. This event was offered free of charge, though we did want to mention that if you feel called to, for instance, support Divinity students' bursaries, that can be done through Trinity's website. There is a Faculty of Divinity drop-down option, and then in the description, type in student bursaries, and that would be very much appreciated and would go towards directly making an impact in students' lives. In the next few days, there will be a survey that will be emailed to participants, and we do really appreciate the feedback, and it will help us put together more meaningful events such as this one tonight. So we do welcome and encourage input. If you are part of the Trinity Divinity alumni community, we ask that you please stay involved. And if you have others in your networks and in your friendships, please do reach out. If there's been an email or a newsletter, reach out to your friends and say, hey, did you see that newsletter? Or as one monastic mentor of mine once said, the next best thing to eternal life is getting on our mailing list because it's almost as long. And so if I assure you, if anyone who is connected tonight, reach out to someone at Trinity College and say, I would love to be put on a Divinity newsletter list. I'm sure they can make that happen. We are working on putting together some special events in the coming months. And so please do have your radar open for those things. And something I did want to highlight is the 70th anniversary of the Trinity College Chapel, which I suppose brings us back into the building, but into a beautiful and meaningful space. November 18th to 20th, that 70th anniversary will be marked. And that will include on November 18th, a symposium called Sustaining Hope and Seeking Justice in Challenging Times, which will have a special convocation ceremony to grant honorary degrees to, as we heard, to Archbishop Linda, and also to Bishop Michael Curry, former presiding bishop of the Episcopal Church in the US. They will share their thoughts on their own ministry and the ongoing mission of the church as an agent of hope and healing in our day. Then on November 19th and 20th, Trinity is hosting an interdisciplinary academic conference called Sacred Spaces, Conflict and Convergences, which will explore the concept of sacred space and its role in contemporary society. There is a call for proposals for this conference open for the rest of the month, and further information on the Trinity College website. So again, I wanted to echo my thanks to Archbishops Anne and Linda, and to Bishop Victoria, to the Trinity Faculty of Divinity, and to all who were a part of this evening. Thank you. May God be with us all, and peace to you all.